In May of 1097, beneath the shadow of ancient Roman walls where the Nicene Creed was born, 30,000 warriors of the First Crusade laid siege to the capital of the Seljuk Turks, and our silver-armored good knight stood among them as the fate of empires hung in the balance. This wasn't just another siege, it was the first true test of Western Christendom against the mounted archers of the East, a brutal collision of civilizations fought across 5 kilometers of stone fortifications that had stood for 1,000 years. Watch as the good knight survives the catastrophic collapse of siege engines, charges against 10,000 Turkish horse archers in the first major cavalry battle of the Crusades, and witnesses the bitter political betrayal that would poison relations between Crusaders and Byzantines for generations to come. From the grisly fields of Civito, where the bones of the People's Crusade still lay unburied, to the secret midnight surrender that denied the Crusaders their rightful plunder, every moment of this epic tale shaped the destiny of the Holy Land campaign. Subscribe to the GoodKnight stories for more immersive historical journeys that transport you to history's greatest turning points, where our eternal knight in silver armor guides you through the rise and fall of empires with storytelling designed for deep focus, relaxation, or peaceful sleep. Comment below which pivotal moment in Crusader history you'd like the good knight to witness next. But for now, settle in, relax, and journey back to that fateful spring of 1097, when the road to Jerusalem began at the walls of Nicaea. Chapter 1. The Bones of Tivitote. The good knight had seen death before. He had walked battlefields where the crows grew fat and the earth turned black with blood. But nothing had prepared him for the field of Civito. It was late April, 1097. The spring sun hung warm over the Bithynian hills as the army of princes, the true crusade, the disciplined crusade, marched east from the Bosporus toward the city of Nicaea. The road was ancient, Roman-built, its stones worn smooth by centuries of legions and merchants. But now it passed through a landscape of horror. The bones lay everywhere. They were scattered across the meadows like a macabre harvest. Skulls grinned from the tall grass. Rib cages jutted from the earth where shallow graves had been torn open by wild dogs. The good knight's destrier, a massive warhorse bred for battle, snorted and sidestepped nervously as its hooves crunched over fragments of human remains. These were the dead of the People's Crusade. 6 months earlier, in October of 1096, a ragged mob of peasants, pilgrims, and minor knights had crossed into Asia Minor under the banner of Peter the Hermit. They had been filled with zeal but empty of discipline, armed with faith but lacking in steel. The Seljuk Sultan Kilij Arslan had lured them into an ambush near this very spot. The slaughter had been total. 20,000 souls, perhaps more, had been cut down in a single day. The good knight rode in silence, his silver armor catching the light. The mail hauberk he wore, 15 kilograms of interlocking iron rings, was already growing warm in the Anatolian heat. Beneath his nasal helmet, sweat began to bead on his forehead. But he did not remove it, not here. Not in this place where death had come so swiftly and so completely. Around him, the army moved like a great serpent of steel and faith. 30,000 infantry marched in loose columns, their spears forming a forest of iron points. 4,500 cavalry rode in disciplined formations, the heavy destriers snorting and stamping. These were not peasants. These were the warriors of Christendom's greatest houses. Godfrey of Bouillon rode at the head of the Lotharingian contingent, his face set in grim determination. Bohemond of Taranto, the Norman giant, commanded the vanguard with his nephew Tancred at his side. Raymond of Toulouse, the eldest of the princes, led the Provençal forces with the papal legate, Bishop Adhemar of Le Puy, riding beside him in full armor. Robert of Normandy, Robert of Flanders, Stephen of Blois, the flower of Western nobility, had answered the Pope's call, and they had all seen the bones. The good knight watched as a young knight, barely old enough to grow a beard, dismounted and knelt beside a skull, half buried in the dirt. The boy made the sign of the cross, his lips moving in silent prayer. When he stood, his face was pale, but his jaw was set. The good knight recognized that look. It was the face of a man who had just understood the stakes. This was not a pilgrimage to a friendly shrine. This was war in a hostile land, and the enemy did not take prisoners. A voice called out from the column ahead, "Keep moving! We make camp at the Sangarius River before nightfall." The good knight urged his horse forward, leaving the field of bones behind. But the image stayed with him. It would stay with all of them. Ahead, somewhere beyond the green hills and the winding roads, lay Nicaea, the capital of the Seljuk Sultanate of Rum, the city of the Nicene Creed, the first great obstacle on the road to Jerusalem. The good knight did not know what awaited him there. He did not know that he would fight in the first great cavalry battle between East and West. He did not know that he would witness the collapse of siege engines and the secret betrayals of emperors. He did not know that the victory he would help win would taste like ashes in his mouth. All he knew, as the sun began to sink toward the western horizon, was that the bones of Civito demanded vengeance. And vengeance, he thought, would be paid in Turkish blood. Chapter 2. The Crossing. The Bosporus had been a trial of patience. For weeks the armies of the Crusade had gathered in Constantinople, that great jewel of the East, that city of domes and spires, where the wealth of empires flowed like water. The good knight had walked its streets in wonder, had seen the Hagia Sophia rising like a mountain of marble and gold, had smelled the spices of the markets, and heard the chanting of Greek priests in languages he did not understand. But wonder had quickly curdled into suspicion. Emperor Alexios Komnenos, the ruler of the Byzantine Empire, had greeted the Crusader princes with smiles and gifts, but also with demands. He had required each of the great lords to swear an oath of fealty, to promise that any lands reconquered from the Turks would be returned to the empire. The princes had resisted. Bohemond had argued. Raymond had bristled. Tancred had outright refused. But in the end, they had all bent the knee. All except Tancred, who had slipped away in the night rather than swear. The good knight had watched these political games with the detachment of a man whose loyalty was to his lord, not to emperors. He had sworn his oath because his prince had sworn. But he had not forgotten the way the Greek guards had watched them, hands on sword hilts, as if the Crusaders were invaders rather than allies. The crossing itself had been a feat of logistics that still amazed him. The Byzantine fleet, sleek dromons with their banks of oars and their terrible Greek fire, had ferried the entire army across the narrow strait to the Asian shore at Pelicanum. Thousands of men, thousands of horses, wagons laden with supplies, siege engines disassembled and bundled in canvas, all of it transported in a matter of days. The good knight had stood on the deck of one of those ships, his horse tethered beside him, and watched the walls of Constantinople recede into the distance. He had wondered if he would ever see them again. Now, days later, the army was deep into Bithynia, the northwestern province of Anatolia. The land here was green and fertile, watered by rivers that flowed down from the mountains. But the roads were terrible. Decades of border warfare between the Byzantines and the Turks had left the infrastructure in ruins. The old Roman military roads, once the pride of empire, had crumbled into rutted tracks choked with brush and fallen trees. The heavy wagons bogged down in mud. The infantry cursed as they stumbled over roots and stones. It was Godfrey of Bouillon who solved the problem. The Duke of Lower Lorraine, a man known for his piety and his practical mind, had organized a corps of 3,000 pioneers, men equipped with axes, saws, and swords, to march ahead of the main column and clear the way. The GoodKnight had watched them work, these engineers of war, hacking through dense scrub, widening narrow paths, laying logs across marshy ground to create corduroy roads for the wagons. It was brutal, unglamorous labor, but it was essential. Without those cleared roads, the heavy cavalry, the GoodKnight and his brothers-in-arms, would have arrived at Nicaea with their horses exhausted and their equipment damaged. And in the battles to come, that would have meant death. The GoodKnight rode in the middle of the column, surrounded by the other knights of his contingent. They were a brotherhood forged in training yards and tournaments, men who had ridden together for years. There was Sir Bertrand, a grizzled veteran with a scar across his cheek and a laugh like gravel. There was young Guillaume, the boy who had prayed over the skull at Civiteaux, still pale but determined. There was Reynald, a giant of a man who could bend horseshoes with his bare hands and who sang bawdy songs to keep spirits high. They did not speak much as they rode. The heat was oppressive, even in late April. The mail hauberks they wore trapped the warmth against their bodies, turning their torsos into ovens. Beneath the armor, they wore padded gambesons, thick quilted jackets designed to absorb the impact of blows, but which also absorbed sweat until they were soaked through. The GoodKnight's throat was dry. His waterskin was nearly empty. He rationed the last few swallows, knowing that the next river was still hours away. Around him, the landscape began to change. The green hills gave way to rockier terrain. In the distance, he could see the peaks of mountains, their summits still capped with snow despite the advancing season. And somewhere beyond those mountains, hidden in a valley beside a great lake, lay Nicaea. The army camped that night beside the Sangarius River, a broad, slow-moving waterway that marked the boundary between the coastal lowlands and the Anatolian interior. The GoodKnight unsaddled his horse, rubbed the animal down with handfuls of grass, and led it to the river to drink. The destrier plunged its muzzle into the cool water and drank deeply, its flanks heaving. The GoodKnight knelt beside it and filled his waterskin, then splashed water on his face. The cold shock was a blessing. For a moment, he allowed himself to close his eyes and simply breathe. When he opened them again, he saw the campfires spreading across the valley like a field of stars. 30,000 men settling in for the night. The smell of cooking meat drifted on the breeze. Someone had managed to hunt a deer. The sound of voices, laughter, the clang of a blacksmith's hammer repairing a broken stirrup. It felt almost peaceful. But the GoodKnight knew better. Peace was an illusion. Somewhere to the east, Sultan Kilij Arslan was gathering his forces. Somewhere ahead, the walls of Nicaea waited, 10 meters high and 5 kilometers around, defended by a garrison that had no intention of surrendering. The GoodKnight lay down on his bedroll, his sword within arm's reach, and stared up at the stars. They were the same stars he had seen in his homeland, thousands of miles to the west. The same stars that had watched over him through every battle, every march, every long night before the storm. He wondered how many more nights he would see them. Sleep came slowly, and when it did, it was filled with dreams of bones and fire. Chapter 3. The city of the Creed, the first sight of Nicaea, stole the breath from the GoodKnight's lungs. It was early May, and the army had crested the final ridge overlooking the valley. Below them, nestled against the eastern shore of a vast, shimmering lake, lay the city, Nicaea. The walls rose like a vision from antiquity, a circuit of stone and brick that stretched for 5 kilometers in a rough rectangle. 114 towers punctuated the curtain wall, each one crowned with crenellations from which archers could rain death on attackers. The masonry was Roman work, ancient, solid, built to last 1,000 years. And it had. The walls had been raised in the 3rd century, reinforced in the 4th, and maintained ever since. They had withstood earthquakes, sieges, and the slow erosion of time. And now they would face the crusade. The good knight sat astride his destrier, his silver armor gleaming in the morning sun, and studied the defenses. The northern wall faced the open plain where the Crusader army was now deploying. The eastern wall ran along the edge of the valley, backed by rising ground. The southern wall guarded the landward approaches from the interior of Anatolia. But it was the western wall that made the good knight's heart sink. The western wall rose directly from the waters of Lake Ascanius, a body of water so vast that the far shore was barely visible as a hazy line on the horizon. The lake was 20 miles long and 10 miles wide, a natural moat that rendered a complete encirclement impossible. The good knight was no engineer, but he understood the implications immediately. As long as the Turks controlled the lake, they could resupply the city by boat. They could bring in reinforcements, evacuate the wounded, even escape if the siege turned against them. The Crusaders could surround the city on 3 sides, but the 4th side would remain open. It was a flaw in the plan. A fatal flaw, perhaps. But the princes had made their decision. The siege would proceed. The army began to deploy. Godfrey of Bouillon took command of the northern sector, his Lotharingian knights and infantry establishing a fortified camp opposite the main gates. Bohemond and Tancred anchored the left flank, their Norman forces digging in with the efficiency of men who had besieged cities before. Robert of Normandy and Robert of Flanders supported the eastern approaches. Raymond of Toulouse and Bishop Adhéma had not yet arrived. They were still marching with the Provençal contingent, delayed by the slower pace of their baggage train. Their absence left the southern wall unwatched, a gap in the encirclement that made the good knight uneasy. The good knight's contingent was assigned to Godfrey's sector. They established their camp in a meadow within sight of the northern gate, a massive structure flanked by twin towers. The gate was closed, its iron-bound doors reinforced with timber beams. Above it, the banners of the Seljuk Sultanate snapped in the breeze, crescents and stars on fields of green and gold. The good knight dismounted and began the laborious process of setting up his tent. It was a simple affair, a canvas shelter just large enough for a bedroll and his equipment. He drove the stakes into the ground with a mallet, his muscles aching from days in the saddle. Around him, the camp was a hive of activity. Men dug latrines, built cooking fires, erected palisades to protect against sorties. And then the first arrows came. They fell like rain, arcing over the walls from the Turkish archers on the ramparts. Most fell short, thudding into the earth harmlessly. But a few found their marks. A scream echoed across the camp as a man went down, an arrow through his thigh. Another man clutched at his shoulder, cursing in French. The good knight grabbed his shield, a kite-shaped slab of wood covered in leather and reinforced with iron, and raised it over his head. An arrow struck the shield with a sharp crack, the iron point punching through the leather but stopping short of his hand. He felt the impact shiver up his arm. "Get to cover!" someone shouted. The good knight ducked behind a wagon, his heart pounding. Around him, men scrambled for shelter, dragging the wounded with them. The arrow storm lasted only a few minutes, but it was enough to make the point. The Turks were not going to make this easy. That night, the good knight stood watch on the perimeter of the camp. The moon was a thin crescent, casting barely enough light to see by. Beyond the palisade, the walls of Nicaea loomed like a black cliff, silent and ominous. He thought about the city's history. This was the place where, in 325 AD, the First Ecumenical Council had convened to define the nature of Christ. The Nicene Creed, recited in every church in Christendom, had been written within those walls. It was a holy place, a place of pilgrimage. And now it was the capital of a Muslim sultanate, its churches converted to mosques, its streets filled with the enemy. The good knight wondered what the bishops of old would think if they could see it now. Would they weep? Would they call for its liberation? Or would they see only the futility of war? A sound broke his reverie, a low, rhythmic chanting from within the city. The good knight strained to hear. It was the call to prayer, the Muslim adhan echoing from the minarets. The sound was alien, unsettling, a reminder that this was not his world. He gripped the hilt of his sword and whispered a prayer of his own. God, grant me strength, grant me courage, and if I am to die here, let it be with honor. The chanting faded. The night grew silent again, and the good knight waited for the dawn. By the third day of the siege, the good knight understood that the greatest enemy was not the Turks. It was hunger. The army had arrived at Nicaea with supplies sufficient for a few days, perhaps a week if rationed carefully. But the local countryside had been stripped bare. The Turks, anticipating the siege, had conducted a scorched earth policy, driving off livestock, burning crops, and poisoning wells. The villages within a day's march were empty, their granaries looted or destroyed, and the Crusaders had 30,000 mouths to feed. The good knight had seen the signs of desperation creeping into the camp. Men who had been jovial and confident now moved with the slow, listless gait of the malnourished. Fights broke out over scraps of bread. The camp followers, the women, children, and non-combatants who traveled with the army, began to look gaunt and hollow-eyed. The price of food became obscene. A single loaf of bread, which in Constantinople had cost a few copper coins, now commanded 20 to 30 denarii, a sum that represented weeks of wages for a common soldier. The good knight, who had a modest purse of silver, could afford to eat, but he watched as men around him tightened their belts and went to sleep with empty stomachs. It was Bohemond of Taranto who broke the crisis. The Norman prince, a man as shrewd in politics as he was fierce in battle, had maintained close ties with the Byzantine officials who accompanied the army. Chief among them was Tatikios, a Greek general with a golden nose, his real nose having been lost in battle years before, who served as the emperor's liaison and guide. Bohemond leveraged these connections to organize a supply line. Within days, a fleet of Byzantine ships arrived at the nearby port of Civito, the same cursed place where the People's Crusade had met its end. The ships were laden with grain, salted fish, wine, and fodder for the horses. The supplies were unloaded and transported overland to the siege camps, via the roads that Godfrey's pioneers had cleared. The good knight was among the men assigned to escort the supply wagons. It was tedious, unglamorous work, riding slowly beside creaking carts, watching the tree line for ambushes that never came. But it was necessary. Without those wagons, the siege would collapse. He remembered the first convoy vividly. The wagons had rolled into camp in the late afternoon, and the men had cheered as if a great victory had been won. The smell of fresh bread baking over the fires that night was like a benediction. The good knight had eaten his share, a thick slice of dark rye, still warm, with a chunk of hard cheese, and felt his strength return. But the relief was temporary. The supply line was fragile, dependent on Byzantine goodwill and the security of the roads. And the good knight could not shake the feeling that the emperor was using the Crusaders' hunger as leverage, a way to keep them dependent and obedient. He thought of the oaths the princes had sworn in Constantinople. He thought of the way Alexius had smiled as they knelt before him, and he wondered what price would eventually be demanded for this bread. The good knight's horse was suffering too. Destriers were not like common horses. They were massive animals, bred for strength and aggression, capable of carrying a fully armored knight into battle and trampling infantry underfoot. But they required enormous amounts of food, grain, hay, and fresh water to maintain their condition. The GoodKnight's mount, a grey stallion he had named Tempest, had begun to lose weight. The ribs were starting to show beneath the sleek coat. The animal's energy was flagging. Each morning, the GoodKnight would inspect Tempest's hooves, check for injuries, and ration out the precious grain he had managed to purchase from the Byzantine supply wagons. He knew that if Tempest went lame or died, he would be reduced to fighting on foot. And a night on foot was half a night. So he cared for the horse as he would care for a brother. He walked Tempest to the river each day to drink. He brushed the coat to keep the skin healthy. He whispered to the animal in the quiet moments, nonsense words of comfort that seemed to calm the beast. And Tempest, in turn, seemed to understand. The horse would nuzzle the GoodKnight's shoulder, would follow him without a lead, would stand patiently as the armor was strapped on. It was a bond forged in hardship. And the GoodKnight knew that in the battles to come, that bond might be the only thing that kept him alive. The GoodKnight was sharpening his sword when the alarm was raised. It was mid-May, perhaps the 16th or the 21st. The days had begun to blur together in the monotony of siege work. The sun was high, the heat oppressive. The GoodKnight sat in the shade of his tent, running a whetstone along the edge of his blade in long, rhythmic strokes. The sound was soothing, almost meditative. And then the horns blew. 3 sharp blasts, the signal for enemy contact. The GoodKnight was on his feet in an instant, his heart hammering. Around him, the camp erupted into controlled chaos. Men grabbed weapons, donned helmets, formed into their units. Sergeants bellowed orders. Horses were saddled in frantic haste. "Mount up! Mount up! The Turks are coming!" The GoodKnight ran to Tempest, threw the saddle over the horse's back, and cinched it tight. His hands moved with the speed of long practice. Bridle, reins, shield strapped to his left arm, lance in his right hand. He swung into the saddle and spurred toward the assembly point. The scene that greeted him was one of organized urgency. Godfrey of Bouillon sat astride his own war horse, his face calm, but his eyes sharp. Beside him, his standard-bearer held the ducal banner high, a golden cross on a field of white. The knights of the Lotharingian contingent were forming into a wedge, the classic cavalry formation designed to punch through enemy lines. The GoodKnight took his place in the formation, Tempest snorting and stamping beneath him. To his left was Sir Bertrand, his scarred face set in a grim smile. To his right was young Guillaume, his knuckles white on the shaft of his lance. "Easy, boy," the GoodKnight said quietly. "Stay close to me. Do what I do." Guillaume nodded, his throat working as he swallowed his fear. And then the enemy appeared. They came from the south, a vast cloud of dust rising into the sky. At first, the GoodKnight could see only the dust. But as the cloud drew closer, shapes began to resolve. Thousands of horsemen, moving fast, their banners streaming in the wind. Sultan Kilij Arslan had returned. The Sultan had been campaigning in the east, fighting the Danish-mend Turks for control of central Anatolia. He had dismissed the initial reports of the Crusader army, believing them to be another rabble like the People's Crusade. But when word reached him that his capital was under siege by a disciplined, heavily armed force, he had abandoned his campaign and raced back with every man he could muster. The relief force numbered perhaps 10,000 mounted archers, light cavalry armed with composite bows, swords, and small round shields. They were the elite of the Seljuk military, men who had been born in the saddle, who could shoot a bow at full gallop, who could feign retreat and then wheel around to strike from an unexpected angle. They were everything the Crusader heavy cavalry was not: fast, mobile, and deadly at range. The GoodKnight felt his mouth go dry. He had trained for this moment his entire life. But training and reality were different things. The Turkish host spread out across the plain, a crescent formation designed to envelop the Crusader positions. Their war cries echoed across the valley, high, ululating shouts that sent chills down the GoodKnight's spine. And then the arrows began to fall. The first volley was a black cloud against the sky, thousands of arrows arcing high and then plummeting down into the Crusader lines. The GoodKnight raised his shield and hunched low in the saddle. The arrows struck like hail, thudding into shields, clanging off helmets, punching into the ground. Tempest screamed and reared as an arrow grazed his flank. The GoodKnight fought to control the horse, his thighs clamping tight, his left hand sawing on the reins. "Hold! Hold the line!" Godfrey's voice cut through the chaos. The GoodKnight looked around. Men were down, horses thrashing, knights struggling to rise under the weight of their armor. But the line held. The shields overlapped, forming a wall of wood and iron. The infantry, positioned behind the cavalry, crouched beneath their own shields and waited. The Turks did not charge. Instead, they circled, staying just out of lance range, and loosed volley after volley. It was a tactic designed to break morale, to bleed the Crusaders, without risking close combat. And it was working. The GoodKnight could feel the frustration building in the ranks. The knights were trained to charge, to close with the enemy and break them with shock and weight. But they could not charge an enemy that refused to stand still. "We have to do something," Guillaume hissed. "We can't just sit here and die." The GoodKnight said nothing. He watched the Turks, studied their movements. They were disciplined, coordinated, but they were also cautious. They feared the Frankish charge. And then, from the south, a new sound rose. The blare of trumpets, the thunder of hooves. Raymond of Toulouse had arrived. The Provençal contingent came like the wrath of God. Raymond's forces had been delayed, marching through the difficult southern routes, but now they crashed into the Turkish flank with the force of an avalanche. Bishop Adhemar rode at the front, his mace swinging, his voice raised in a battle hymn. The Turks, caught between two forces, wavered. "Now!" Godfrey roared. "Charge!" The GoodKnight did not think. He spurred Tempest forward, his lance levelled, his voice joining the roar of hundreds of knights as they surged across the plain. The world narrowed to a tunnel. The thunder of hooves, the weight of the lance in his hand, the enemy rushing toward him. A Turkish rider loomed in front of him, bow raised. The GoodKnight saw the arrow loose, saw it coming straight for his chest. He twisted in the saddle, felt the arrow glance off his shoulder pauldron, and then his lance struck. The impact jarred his entire body. The lance punched through the Turk's leather armor and lifted the man, clean out of the saddle. The GoodKnight released the lance, let it fall with the body still impaled on it, and drew his sword. The melee was a nightmare of noise and violence. Horses collided, men screamed, steel rang on steel. The GoodKnight hacked and slashed, his sword rising and falling in brutal arcs. Blood sprayed across his armor. A Turkish blade scraped along his helmet, the screech of metal on metal deafening. Tempest bit and kicked, a warhorse doing what it was bred to do. The GoodKnight felt the horse crush a man beneath its hooves, felt the sickening crunch of bone. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, it was over. The Turks broke. They wheeled their horses and fled, scattering across the plain in a disorganized rout. The Crusaders pursued for a short distance, cutting down the stragglers, but Godfrey called them back before they could be drawn too far from the siege lines. The GoodKnight reined in Tempest, his chest heaving, his sword dripping red. Around him, the field was littered with bodies, Turkish and Crusader alike. The cries of the wounded filled the air. He looked down at his hands. They were shaking. He had survived. Again. But the cost was written in the faces of the dead. The aftermath of the battle was a grim education in the realities of medieval warfare. The good knight dismounted and walked among the fallen, leading Tempest by the reins. The horse was limping slightly. The arrow graze on its flank was superficial, but it needed to be cleaned and bandaged. The good knight made a mental note to see to it as soon as he returned to camp. But first, there was the matter of the dead. The Crusader casualties were lighter than they might have been, thanks to the timely arrival of Raymond's forces. But lighter was a relative term. The good knight counted at least 50 knights down, their bodies sprawled in the trampled grass. Some had been killed by arrows, the shafts still protruding from gaps in their armor. Others had been cut down in the melee, their skulls split or their throats opened. The infantry had suffered worse. The lightly armored foot soldiers had borne the brunt of the Turkish archery. The good knight saw men with arrows in their chests, their legs, their faces. Some were still alive, moaning in agony, begging for water or for a priest. The good knight knelt beside one such man, a young soldier, no older than 20, with an arrow through his belly. The wound was mortal. The good knight could see the blood pooling beneath him, dark and thick. "Am I going to die?" the boy whispered. The good knight wanted to lie, to offer comfort, but he had never been good at lying. "Yes," he said quietly, "but you fought bravely. God will remember." The boy's eyes filled with tears. "I don't want to die. I want to go home." The good knight took the boy's hand and held it. He stayed there, kneeling in the blood-soaked grass, until the light faded from the boy's eyes. Then he stood, made the sign of the cross, and moved on. The Turkish dead were treated differently. The good knight watched as a group of soldiers moved among the fallen Turks, methodically decapitating the corpses. The heads were collected in baskets, grisly trophies that would serve a purpose beyond mere savagery. That night, the Crusaders assembled their siege engines, mangonels and petraries, stone-throwing machines powered by twisted rope and counterweights. The heads of the Turkish dead were loaded into the slings, and then, one by one, they were hurled over the walls of Nicaea. The good knight stood and watched as the severed heads arced through the air, tumbling end over end, before disappearing beyond the battlements. He heard the distant shouts of alarm from within the city, the cries of horror as the heads landed in the streets. It was psychological warfare, designed to break the morale of the defenders, to show them that their sultan had failed, that their relief force had been shattered, that they were alone. The good knight felt no satisfaction in it, only a cold, hollow emptiness. This was war. This was what it meant to fight for God and glory. And it was uglier than any song or story had ever told him. That night, the good knight sat by his campfire and cleaned his armor. The blood had dried into a dark crust on the mail rings, and it took patient work with a rag and a bucket of water to scrub it away. His hands were raw by the time he finished, but the armor gleamed silver once more. Sir Bertrand sat across from him, sharpening his own sword. The older knight had a cut across his forearm, hastily bandaged with a strip of linen. He seemed unbothered by it. "You did well today," Bertrand said, without looking up. "Saw you take that rider clean off his horse. Good thrust." The good knight said nothing. "First real battle?" Bertrand asked. "No," the good knight said. "But the first against the Turks." Bertrand nodded. "They're different, aren't they? Not like fighting other Christians. They don't stand and trade blows. They dance around you, prick you to death with arrows. Frustrating as hell." "We broke them," the good knight said. "This time," Bertrand agreed. "But Kilij Arslan is still out there, and he's not going to give up his capital without a fight. This was just the opening move." The good knight looked toward the walls of Nicaea, dark against the starlit sky. Somewhere inside those walls, the Turkish garrison was burying their dead. tending their wounded and preparing for the next assault. And somewhere beyond the horizon, the Sultan was regrouping, planning his next move. The siege had only just begun. Chapter 7. The Fox. The days after the battle settled into a rhythm of tedium and danger. The GoodKnight found himself assigned to rotating duties, guard shifts on the perimeter, escort duty for hard supply wagons, and the back-breaking labor of siege construction. The glamour of knighthood, he thought bitterly, did not extend to digging ditches or hauling timber. But the work was necessary. The Crusader engineers, under the direction of Godfrey of Bouillon and the Byzantine advisors, were constructing a series of siege engines designed to breach the walls of Nicaea. The most ambitious of these was a machine known as a fox, or vinea, a massive mobile shelter that would allow miners to approach the base of the walls and undermine the foundations. The GoodKnight watched the construction with a mixture of awe and skepticism. The fox was an enormous structure, built from heavy timbers and covered with layers of wicker and animal hides soaked in water to prevent it from being set alight. It was designed to be wheeled up to the wall, where it would provide cover for the miners as they dug beneath the masonry. The target was the Gonatas Tower, a section of the wall that had been damaged in previous conflicts and reinforced by the Turks. The engineers believed it was a weak point, a place where the foundations might be vulnerable. The GoodKnight was not an engineer, but he had his doubts. The walls of Nicaea were Roman work, built to last, and the Turks had had years to strengthen them. Still, orders were orders. The assault on the Gonatas Tower began on a hot afternoon in late May. The GoodKnight was part of the covering force, positioned with a group of knights and infantry to protect the fox from sorties by the Turkish garrison. He stood in the shadow of the great machine, his shield raised, his eyes on the walls above. The fox was rolled forward on massive wooden wheels, pushed by teams of men straining against the weight. It moved slowly, ponderously, like some great beast lumbering toward its prey. The defenders on the walls saw it coming and responded with a hail of arrows and stones. The GoodKnight heard the impacts, the thud of arrows embedding in the wicker, the crash of stones bouncing off the reinforced roof. The men inside the fox were protected, but the covering force was exposed. An arrow hissed past the GoodKnight's ear, close enough that he felt the wind of its passage. "Shields up!" someone shouted. The GoodKnight crouched behind his shield, feeling the impacts as arrows struck the wood. Beside him, a soldier grunted and fell, an arrow through his thigh. The GoodKnight dragged the man back, out of the line of fire, and left him for the camp followers to retrieve. The fox reached the base of the wall. The miners inside began their work, digging into the earth, prying at the foundation stones. The plan was to excavate a chamber beneath the wall, prop it up with wooden beams, and then set the beams alight. When the props burned through, the wall above would collapse. It was a sound strategy. In theory. The GoodKnight did not see the collapse. He was rotating off duty, heading back to camp for a meal and a few hours of rest, when he heard the sound. It was a deep, grinding roar, like the earth itself splitting open. The GoodKnight spun around and saw a cloud of dust rising from the base of the Gonatas Tower. And then the screaming started. He ran back toward the wall, his heart pounding. Other men were running too, converging on the site of the disaster. As the dust began to clear, the GoodKnight saw what had happened. The fox had been crushed. The wall had not collapsed outward, as intended. Instead, a section of the tower had fallen straight down, its immense weight pulverizing the siege engine beneath it. The timbers of the fox were splintered like kindling. The wicker and hides were buried under tons of stone and brick, and the men inside were dead. The GoodKnight joined the frantic effort to dig through the rubble. His hands bled as he hauled away chunks of masonry, searching for survivors. But there were none. The bodies they pulled from the wreckage were broken, crushed beyond recognition. 20 knights, 20 men who had volunteered for the duty, who had believed in the plan, who had trusted the engineers. All dead. The good knight sat back on his heels, his hands shaking, and stared at the ruin. Around him, men wept openly. Others stood in stunned silence. Godfrey of Bouillon arrived, his face pale. He knelt beside the bodies, made the sign of the cross, and prayed. When he stood, his voice was hoarse. "Bury them with honor," he said. "They died in the service of God." The good knight wanted to scream. He wanted to rage at the futility of it, at the waste. But he said nothing. He simply turned away and walked back to camp, his armor caked with dust and blood. That night, he did not sleep. Chapter 8. The Lake. The failure of the Fox forced a reassessment of the siege strategy. The Crusader princes convened in Godfrey's tent, a war council that included the Byzantine liaison, Tatikios. The good knight was not privy to the discussions, but the results were clear enough. The siege would continue, but the focus would shift from direct assault to blockade. The goal was to starve the city into submission, to cut off all supplies and reinforcements until the garrison had no choice but to surrender. There was only one problem: the lake. As long as the western wall of Nicaea remained open to Lake Ascanius, the Turks could resupply by boat. The Crusaders had no navy, no way to contest control of the water. The blockade was incomplete, and everyone knew it. It was Tatikios who proposed the solution. The good knight heard the rumors before he saw the evidence. Men spoke in hushed, awed tones of a Byzantine miracle, of ships that would sail across land. He dismissed it as camp, gossip, the kind of wild tale that soldiers told to pass the time. And then he saw the boats. They came overland, hauled on massive ox carts and log rollers. A fleet of small cruisers and transport vessels disassembled and carried piece by piece from the Gulf of Nicaea. The good knight stood and watched as the convoy rolled past, a procession of hulls and masts and oars that seemed impossible, absurd, but it was real. The Byzantines reassembled the boats on the shore of Lake Ascanius, working with the speed and efficiency of men who had done this before. Within days, a flotilla was ready, manned by Greek sailors and commanded by General Manuel Boutumitis, a veteran of countless campaigns. The good knight watched from the shore as the boats launched, their oars dipping into the water in perfect unison. The Byzantine war galleys moved across the lake like predators, sleek and deadly. And on the morning of June 17th, the Turkish garrison woke to see the imperial banners flying from the masts of ships on the lake. The blockade was complete. The psychological impact was immediate. The good knight saw it in the behavior of the defenders. The sorties, which had been frequent and aggressive, ceased almost entirely. The archery from the walls slackened. The city, which had seemed defiant and unyielding, now felt like a trap closing in on itself. The good knight allowed himself a moment of hope. Perhaps the siege would end without further bloodshed. Perhaps the Turks would see the futility of resistance and surrender. But hope, he had learned, was a dangerous thing. Chapter 9. The Secret Surrender. The good knight was sharpening his sword when the order came. "All units, prepare for general assault. Dawn, June 19th. The camp erupted into activity. This was it, the final push. The siege towers were rolled into position, massive wooden structures that would allow the Crusaders to scale the walls. Ladders were distributed. Grappling hooks were readied. The priests moved through the ranks, offering blessings and hearing confessions. The good knight confessed his sins to a Benedictine monk, a young man with kind eyes who listened without judgment. When it was done, the good knight felt lighter, cleansed. If he died tomorrow, he would die in a state of grace. He spent the night checking his equipment. Every strap, every buckle, every link of mail. He sharpened his sword until the edge could split a hair. He prayed, and then he waited for the dawn. The sun rose on June 19th, 1097, and the GoodKnight stood in formation with the assault force, ready to storm the walls of Nicaea. But the assault never came. As the light spread across the valley, the GoodKnight saw something that made his blood run cold. The banners flying from the towers of Nicaea were not the crescents and stars of the Seljuk Sultanate. They were the double-headed eagles of the Byzantine Empire. The GoodKnight stood in stunned silence as the truth became clear. The city had surrendered, not to the Crusaders, but to the Byzantines. During the night, while the Crusader army slept, General Manuel Butumitz had negotiated a secret surrender with the Turkish garrison. The terms were generous. The defenders would be allowed to leave with their lives, the Sultan's family would be taken into Byzantine custody and treated with honor, and the city would be handed over intact. The Crusaders had not been consulted. They had not been informed. They had been, in effect, cut out of their own victory. The GoodKnight felt a wave of anger so intense it left him shaking. Around him, the other knights were shouting, cursing, demanding answers. The common soldiers, who had counted on the plunder of Nicaea to pay for their journey, were on the verge of mutiny. Godfrey of Bouillon rode among the ranks, his face grim, trying to restore order. "Stand down! Stand down! This is not the time!" But the damage was done. The GoodKnight was among the small groups of crusaders allowed to enter the city later that day. They were permitted entry in groups of 10, unarmed, ostensibly to pray at the churches. It was a humiliation. The GoodKnight walked through the streets of Nicaea, his silver armor left behind in camp, wearing only a simple tunic. The city was intact, untouched by the sack that should have been theirs by right. The markets were open, the people going about their business as if nothing had happened. Byzantine soldiers stood guard at every corner, watching the Crusaders with expressions that ranged from pity to contempt. The GoodKnight entered the church of Hagia Sophia, not the great cathedral in Constantinople, but a smaller church dedicated to the same holy wisdom. He knelt before the altar and tried to pray, but the words would not come. All he could think about was the men who had died, the boy with the arrow in his belly, the 20 knights crushed beneath the fox, the hundreds who had bled and suffered to bring this city to its knees. And for what? So that the emperor could add another jewel to his crown. The GoodKnight rose and walked out of the church. He did not look back. Chapter 10. The Payout. Emperor Alexios Komnenos was many things, but he was not a fool. He understood that the Crusader army was on the verge of revolt. He understood that the secret surrender had poisoned the well of trust between the Latins and the Greeks. And he understood that gold could soothe many wounds. The payout began within days of the city's surrender. The princes, Godfrey, Bohemond, Raymond, Robert, were summoned to the emperor's camp at Pelicanum and showered with gifts. Gold coins by the chest, silver plate, war horses of the finest Byzantine stock, silks and jewels and promises of future support. The GoodKnight watched as his own lord returned from the meeting, his saddlebags heavy with imperial largesse. The message was clear. The emperor was buying their loyalty, one gift at a time. For the common soldiers, the payout was more modest. The GoodKnight received a handful of copper coins, tatartara, stamped with the image of Christ Pantocrator. It was enough to buy a kit, few meals, to replace a worn piece of equipment. It was not enough to replace the plunder of a city, but it was something. The most dramatic moment came when Tancred, the young Norman who had refused to swear the oath in Constantinople, was brought before the emperor. The good knight heard the story second-hand, but it spread through the camp like wildfire. Alexios had offered Tancred a fortune in gold and a promise of lands in Anatolia, on the condition that he swear the oath of fealty. Tancred, faced with the choice between pride and pragmatism, had knelt and sworn. The good knight did not know whether to admire the emperor's cunning or despise Tancred's capitulation. Perhaps both. Chapter 11. The Road Ahead. By the end of June, the Crusader army was ready to march. Nicaea was behind them, a victory that tasted like ashes. The road to Jerusalem lay ahead, 1,000 miles of hostile territory, scorching deserts and fortified cities. The good knight stood on the edge of the camp and looked east toward the Anatolian plateau. Somewhere out there, Sultan Kilij Arslan was regrouping, gathering allies, preparing for the next battle. The good knight thought of the bones at Siveto. He thought of the boy who had died in his arms. He thought of the 20 knights crushed beneath the fox. And he thought of the silver coins in his purse, the emperor's blood money. He did not know what the future held. He did not know if he would survive the next battle or the one after that. He did not know if he would ever see Jerusalem. But he knew one thing. He would keep walking. He would keep fighting, because that was what he had sworn to do. The good knight turned away from the east and walked back to his tent. Tempest was waiting, the grey destrier nickering softly as he approached. The good knight stroked the horse's muzzle and whispered a promise. "We'll see this through, old friend, one way or another." The horse snorted, as if in agreement, and the good knight allowed himself a small, bitter smile. The night before the army was to depart Nicaea, the good knight sat alone by his campfire and stared into the flames. The camp around him was alive with activity, men packing their gear, sharpening weapons, saying farewells to the camp followers who would not be continuing the journey. But the good knight felt apart from it all, as if he were watching from a great distance. He thought about the siege, about the things he had seen and done. He had killed men. He had watched friends die. He had witnessed acts of courage and acts of cruelty. He had seen the best and worst of humanity, often in the same moment. And he had learned something about himself. He was not a hero. He was not a saint. He was simply a man, trying to survive in a world that cared nothing for his survival. The songs and stories had lied to him. They had told him that war was glorious, that knights were noble, that God rewarded the faithful. But the reality was different. War was ugly and brutal and senseless. Knights were men, no better and no worse than anyone else. And God, if he was watching, seemed content to let them bleed. The good knight did not regret his choice to take the cross. He believed in the cause, in the liberation of the Holy Land, but he no longer believed in the illusions. He was a soldier, and soldiers did what they were told and hoped to live another day. Sir Bertrand approached the fire, a wineskin in his hand. He sat down beside the good knight without asking permission and took a long drink. "Thinking deep thoughts?" Bertrand asked. "Something like that," the good knight said. Bertrand offered the wineskin. The good knight took it and drank. The wine was sour, but it warmed his belly. "You did well at Nicaea," Bertrand said. "Better than most. You kept your head when others lost theirs. That's worth something." "Is it?" the good knight asked. Bertrand shrugged. "It kept you alive. That's all that matters." The good knight handed back the wineskin. "What do you think happens next?" "We march," Bertrand said. "We fight. Some of us die. The rest keep marching." "And if we make it to Jerusalem?" Bertrand smiled, a hard, cynical smile. "Then we'll have a whole new set of problems, but that's a worry for another day." The two men sat in silence, watching the fire burn down to embers. The army left Nicaea on a bright morning in early July. The GoodKnight rode near the front of the column, his silver armor gleaming in the sun. Tempest was well fed and rested, the horse's strength restored by the weeks of relative inactivity during the siege. As they marched past the walls of Nicaea, the GoodKnight looked up at the towers. The Byzantine banners still flew from the ramparts, the double-headed eagles snapping in the breeze. Greek soldiers watched from the walls, their expressions unreadable. The GoodKnight felt no triumph, only a dull, weary resignation. This was the first victory of the Crusade, but it had come at a cost that could not be measured in gold or territory. It had cost trust, it had cost lives, and it had revealed the fault lines that would eventually tear the Crusade apart. But for now, the army marched on. The road ahead was long and uncertain. The GoodKnight did not know what awaited him in the battles to come. He did not know if he would survive the crossing of the Anatolian plateau, or the siege of Antioch, or the final assault on Jerusalem. But he knew that he would face it with the same grim determination that had carried him through Nicaea. He was the GoodKnight. He had walked through the bones of Sivitote and emerged on the other side. He had fought the Sultan's relief force and survived. He had witnessed the collapse of the Fox and the secret surrender and the Emperor's payout. And he was still standing. That, he thought, was victory enough. The column stretched for miles, a river of steel and faith flowing east into the unknown. The GoodKnight rode in silence, his eyes on the horizon, his hand resting on the hilt of his sword. Somewhere ahead, the road to Jerusalem waited, and the GoodKnight would walk it, one step at a time, until the journey was done. Years later, when the GoodKnight was an old man, though he would never truly age, never truly die, he would look back on the siege of Nicaea and understand its significance. It was the first test, the first time the Crusaders had faced the reality of their mission, the first time they had tasted victory and found it bitter. Nicaea had taught them that the Turks could be beaten, but not easily. It had taught them that the Byzantines were allies of convenience, not of conviction. It had taught them that the road to Jerusalem would be paved with blood and betrayal. And it had taught the GoodKnight something about himself. He was not invincible. He was not immortal, despite the silver armor that seemed to turn aside every blade. He was simply a man who had learned to endure. And endurance, in the end, was the only victory that mattered. The GoodKnight rode on, into the heat of the Anatolian summer, into the battles that would define the First Crusade. He did not know what the future held, but he knew that he would face it, because that was what he did. That was who he was, the GoodKnight.